Singing Dutchman Productions. Hello and welcome to Doug's Front Porch, a podcast where I get to sit down with friends old and new and have honest conversations. Today I welcome Brad Smith to the front porch, a friend that I've known for quite a while through Pennsylvania Dutch circles, but we're going to be talking about a couple other things today. Brad, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Doug. It's good to be here.
It is great to have you here. You have a very interesting background, and I just can't wait to share some of your knowledge with the listeners. But I always like to start every episode kind of the same way. Tell us a little bit about, where you grew up. What was your, did you have brothers and sisters? What was your childhood like?
Sure. So I grew up in Schaefferstown, Pennsylvania, which is in eastern Lebanon County. My dad's family was from Berks County originally. My mom, her ancestors were always in Lebanon County for the most part. So I was the oldest of four kids, and we grew up in a 1740s old stone farmhouse. And Schaefferstown was just a great place to grow up. We had so much fun. It was a nice, tight-knit community, very, very Dutchy. And when we were little, we heard Pennsylvania Dutch probably every single day.
That's crazy. Tell us a little bit about this old house that you grew up in, 1700s era stone house. I'm sure that had its pluses, but it might have had its minuses too. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure, yeah. And my mom still lives there, and so it's been in our family. My parents bought it in 1974. And I remember this because they moved in October 1974, and I was just a baby then. And it just so happened that they were move-in day was the same day as the Schaefferstown Halloween parade. And they had this big moving van in their driveway. And new neighbors knocked on the door and said, "Hey, you might want to get that moving van out of here, or he's going to be stuck all night because of the parade."
So, in these antique homes, when you have a house that's over 200 plus years old, is there anything specific about the house that you remember or that's kind of like burned in your image that was different? Like if you went to a friend's house that was a more modern house or something like that, that you'd be like, oh, it's different at my home.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And really on every single level. We had, of course, running water and electricity and such, but well, when I was young, we never locked the door, but when we did, we used a skeleton key to lock the back door. And so I'd go to friends' houses who had locks that were modern and use modern keys, and I thought this was the strangest thing I ever saw.
How was it to heat the house? Was it tough to heat that old stone house, or was it pretty good?
Yeah, and I remember it always being a little on the cold side. In the winter time, it was probably in the low 60s there because it was just so big, and there were storm windows on the second floor, but not on the first floor. Now there are today, but for the house had actually been restored by a couple before my parents bought it, and their feeling was that they didn't want to put storm windows in front of the old windows on the first floor because they just looked so nice, and they had the wavy glass panes, and they didn't want to obscure that with a bunch of storm windows. So they looked beautiful, but the drawback then was it was chilly.
Yeah, right. No, I hear you. I grew up in a really old farmhouse too. Ours wasn't stone. The interior was log, but I know what you mean. Those old homes were they have a character all themselves for sure.
Yeah, and the kitchen had old floorboards. And I'm still teased by my mother to this day. When I was little, I hated peas, and I didn't want to eat my peas, but there were little cracks in the floorboards because they were these old boards, and below the floorboards it was just a dirt floor. So when no one was looking, I'd try and sneak my peas into the crack in the floorboards.
That's cool. That's a good story. Well, now that you say all this, this kind of answers one question for me. So we're going to talk about how your whole career professionally is involved and deeply rooted in history. So as a kid, were you a history nerd as a kid, so to speak?
Well, yes, and I really say I always was. And there were maybe three things that really influenced it. And I could tell you about all three if you'd like to hear true
Yeah, go
stories.
ahead. Go ahead.
So the first one I'd say was my mother. She was not particularly interested in history when we moved into the old stone house, but there were so many fascinating aspects to the house. She really kind of got hooked. Plus, particularly, she had a lot of heirlooms from her side of the family. It just sort of worked out that a lot of this great old furniture just trickled down to her. For example, she still has the bedroom set of my great 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 grandparents, Heinrich Hitz and Rebecca Achenbach Hitz. Through them, by the way, I'm related to Achenbach's pastries. That's one of my claims to fame. Them and Seltzer's bologna, I have relations with both of them, so I feel very lucky about that. but so that bedroom set is from the 1860s, and my mom has the dresser and the bed, and it was a rope bed, but they sort of converted it to accept a new mattress. And I think that was my sister's bed for the first 20 years of her life till she went away to college. And that was just her bed. It wasn't really even something we thought that much about. But my mom really got interested in probably around the bicentennial of 1976 or so. She really got interested in researching other old houses in the area, and she was involved with a group of people who were interested in maybe creating a national historic district for Schaefferstown. And I don't think that ever really came to fruition, but there was a lot of research that went into it. And that's really what my mom talked about all the time. And my siblings didn't really care that much, but to me, I was fascinated. I wanted to hear, oh, so and so has a so and so's house has a reclining chair truss system up in the attic. So you know what that means, either thatched roof or beaver tile. So my mom and I would be having these conversations, and I was 10 years old, and my other kids thought I was a weirdo. but but we just talked about that kind of stuff all the time growing up, and it was just kind of a part of growing up. But then another thing that I think really influenced me, my mom's mom, her maiden name was Hitz, Heat in Pennsylvania Dutch, and she was very, very Dutchy. Her parents, I remember her dad, my great grandpa, I called him Papa Hitz, and he was actually a powwow person. And when I was little, I was told that Papa Hitz has the gift, and it was something my Grammy especially took very, very seriously. We didn't joke about that or talk about it too much, but just that Papa Hitz has the gift. At any rate, so my mom's mom, who I called Grammy, she went senile when she got older, or as we'd say, she got funny in the head. And we were cleaning out her apartment, and here, lo and behold, we found that she had written this autobiography many years earlier, page after page after page after page. And she was born in 1913, and her memory, her recall was incredible, almost savant level, like talking about the cost of a bushel of corn in 1920 when she would have been 7 years old. Just so much detail, talking about all four of her grandparents, who would be my great great grandparents. So, for example, from all that writing she did, I know that my great great grandfather, Jacob Baumgartner, had a horse named Charlie. And just so to me, this is common knowledge. And I'm so thankful for that. But it really was really inspired by that. And So that really, I think, shaped me as well, really got me appreciating history. And then the third story is maybe a silly story. This would have been about 1985 or so. There was a TV miniseries on George Washington, and it starred Barry Bostwick. And I now have it on VHS tape. It's pretty corny, actually, when I watch it as an adult. But as a 11-year-old kid, I thought this was awesome because it traces everything from George Washington as a kid, as a surveyor, in the French and Indian War, the Revolution, to his presidency. And I just was so amazed by this. And shortly after watching this, my parents took me to Washington Crossing Historic Park in Bucks County. And sitting in the house where George Washington had the big meeting where he planned this out, where he shared his plans, and on the miniseries they had these other generals, and they're saying, some are saying this is preposterous, and George Washington is saying it has to work. We have to do this. And even at 11 years old, I realized that's the moment. Like, if George Washington makes a different play, the United States ends 6 months after it began. But he made a bold choice, and we know the rest of the story. And I stood in the house as an 11-year-old kid where that happened, where I had just seen Barry Bostwick acting it out. I was so hooked. At that point, I was just hooked, absolutely hooked, enamored, and fascinated.
I have a similar story, not with Washington, but when I was a child, there were like two miniseries that went through TV dealing with the Civil War. So the one was the North and the South with Patrick Swayze, and I
I
mean,
remember that one.
and the
Yeah.
other one was called The Blue and the Gray. My brother and I, we must have recorded it with our VCR, and we wore those cassettes out. And same kind of story. Here we were, I was probably 11, 12, and my brother was even younger. And there we were, instead of watching cartoons, we were watching these like Civil War period dramas, and completely falling in love with the history as well. So I know exactly what you're saying. I wasn't the typical kid, I guess, either in that sense.
Yeah.
So you had these three experiences that shaped you and gave you not only an understanding of what history is, but also the value in it, I guess. And you those shaped you and moved you forward. And let's jump ahead a little bit. You go to college, you get a degree in history. One job, I want to talk about three of your jobs. The one that I want to start with is, at one point, you were the senior curator of the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission,
Well,
correct?
at the State Museum, which is considered their flagship of sorts.
Uh-huh. So can we talk about, for the average Pennsylvanian, and people who aren't Pennsylvanian that are listening, this other states I'm sure have these systems in place too. What is the Historical and Museum Commission in Pennsylvania? Like, what do they do?
So they trace their origins back to the early 1900s. In fact, the State Museum, even earlier than that, has been around since the late 1800s. But basically, they're a historical agency, and they do a couple things. They run about 26 or so field sites, like Cornwall Iron Furnace, Landis Valley Museum, Effort Cloister, Daniel Boone Homestead, although some of those, like Daniel Boone, Conrad Weiser is another one. It's more of like a partnership where they take care of the facility and local groups actually run the historic sites. So they've got about 26 of those all over the state. Then they run the Pennsylvania State Archives, the State Museum where I worked, and the Bureau for what used to be called the Bureau for Historic Preservation, now known as the State Historic Preservation Office. And they do things like National Register nominations. They do those blue and yellow historic markers. And a big thing they also do is if someone wants to build a factory and it turns out that factory is going to go on a site that has some history to it, they review that to make sure there's not a negative impact to the integrity of whatever history might be.
And also to clear this question up that people might have. So if they visit one of these sites, whether it's Cornwall Iron Furnace or the State Museum, for example, the funding to run these sites, is it majority coming from tax dollars?
Yes and no. The simple answer is yes. Tax dollars fund what they call the general operating budget. But in many instances, what is in the general budget is enough to run the basics. But for special projects or kind of unique programming, things that kind of go above and beyond, a lot of them rely on nonprofit associate groups who do a lot of separate fundraising. And Landis Valley, for example, the Railroad Museum of Pennsylvania in Strasburg, they have particularly active associate groups. And then with Daniel Boone and Conrad Weiser, essentially the associate groups have actually taken over day-to-day operations at the sites.
So tell our listeners about the State Museum in Harrisburg. I've been there multiple times, and I think every Pennsylvanian should visit it for sure. And it's great for non-Pennsylvanians too.
Oh,
but
yeah.
I mean, it's one of these sites that, in my opinion, there are a couple places in Pennsylvania. See if you agree with this. There are a couple places in Pennsylvania that every Pennsylvanian should visit. Independence Hall in Philadelphia, Gettysburg Battlefield in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, the State Museum. Those are, for my money, I think those three are absolute musts for any Pennsylvanian. But and a lot of people know Gettysburg, and a lot of people know Independence Hall because of how important those two places were in our history as a country. But I don't think a lot of Pennsylvanians truly know what the State Museum is or what it even does. So tell everybody a little bit about that.
Sure, yeah, and that's a great question. And before I do, though, I'll make a little side note. I remember one day I got in the elevator with my boss, and there was Doug Maidenford. Remember that?
Yes. Yeah, I had a student group down there that day.
And you and I just started talking in Pennsylvania Dutch, and my boss was so blown away by that. And she still to this day talks about that, the day I got in the elevator and started talking in a foreign language to somebody. And that was a happy moment because it was almost like, yeah, it almost to me made a statement. Oh yeah, Pennsylvania Dutch is spoken here at the State Museum, the museum of our state.
Yeah.
But getting back to your question, the museum has evolved a lot over the years, but basically it is the science, history, and art museum of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. It's right next door to the Capitol. And what I love about the State Museum is it has something for everyone. If your thing is cars, they've got old cars. If you like dinosaurs, they've got dinosaurs. If you like the Revolutionary War, they've got that. Civil War, you're covered. Decorative arts, anything. They've got anything you can think of. And one of the jobs I did there while I was senior curator, which was a tremendous undertaking, but a lot of fun, was I worked with the team that was responsible for doing an inventory of every object in the history collection. Just in the history collection, we had 150,000 objects. And probably only 10% of that is actually on exhibit. So when you go into the State Museum, you'll see great things, but it's really just scratching the surface of this collection, which really has been growing for over 100 years.
All right, a quick question. You worked there. What, in your mind, what are one or a few of the things that you could see it or touch it, that every time you did, it either gave you shivers or you had that moment like, I can't believe I have the privilege to hold this thing in my hands, or I have the privilege of putting my eyes on this thing every day when I go to work?
Well, I was about to say, oh, that's easy, but now I'm second guessing my knee jerk reaction to that question. The one that came to my mind first was we borrowed at one point for a special exhibit, William Penn's personal copy of his Bible that he used. And when we're handling something like that, we use gloves, special gloves to protect the item. We handle it very, very carefully. So it's not like we're thumbing through and reading it, but just to hold in my hands the Bible of William Penn and to think about how that might have shaped his views, influenced the creation of Pennsylvania, the concepts of religious freedom that he established for the colony, and how those then subsequently influenced our nation, that sent chills down my spine. That's probably number one. But another, oh, there's so many. There is a flag used in the Revolutionary War, and the unit escapes me at the moment. But the long and the short of it is, it was in the thick of so much action in the Revolutionary War, including literally going back to Washington, crossing the Delaware. This flag literally crossed the Delaware River on a boat, December 1776, with Washington's army. And just to imagine that, I can't even wrap my head around it.
Yeah, I'm picturing little Bradley, going back like there,
Mm-hmm.
you tell this story about how that was such a, an important part of your, of your development of your youth, and then fast forward to adult Brad, and here he has the opportunity to, hold something that was on
Yeah.
this, actually took place. Like, that object saw in real life what you have always kind of like, thought about. It's so powerful. It's unbelievable story.
Yeah, and you talked about little Bradley, and in a way, and I think you'll get this. When I show up at work, whether it's at the State Museum or my current job at the Berks History Center, I'm still little Bradley every day, just losing my mind over the stuff I see.
That's great. I'll put a link to the State Museum's website in the show notes, because seriously, everybody out there that is within driving distance of Harrisburg, whether you're a Pennsylvania citizen or not, you have to go. It is a great museum, and like Brad said, it tells the story in a very user-friendly way, in my opinion.
Oh yeah, yeah.
And it's like you said, if you don't want to look at Civil War stuff, then you go to the next room and all of a sudden you're looking at, like you said, dinosaur bones, or they have a really great exhibit, or at least the last time I was there, on the Native American population of Pennsylvania and their story. And I learned something new every time I go to that museum.
Yeah.
It's when you were there, I mean, but that was quite. I wanted to ask you about this. You were there while COVID was going on. How did that affect the museum?
Well, the museum world was definitely impacted severely by it. And, it's the kind of thing where, as I'm sure it is with all businesses and every person out there, that there really was not a precedent in recent memory where we could say, oh, well, back in 1987, we just managed this through X, Y, and Z. We really didn't know what to do. And it took some time to kind of figure out a game plan. Initially, some of the conversations were just on how do we suddenly take our whole workforce and send everyone home and have a modicum of some productivity. So just initially, we're just trying to figure out how to have a virtual meeting and learning like the Zoom. What is Zoom? I never heard of this Zoom business. And but then we kind of got the hang of that a little bit, and I have to give a lot of credit to Beth Hager, who was my supervisor there. Her attitude was, we really want to keep our programming going. We want to keep a presence out there, keep connecting with the public, with our audience, with the people of Pennsylvania, even if we can't open the doors right now and let them in, or can only do that in limited numbers. So we started doing a virtual program series in 2021, and I was on a team of about 6 of us that developed this program. It was called Learn at Lunchtime. It was a program that already existed, but for 2021 we changed it to an all virtual program, and basically every Friday at lunchtime we did something. And I typically was responsible for about one program or 1 or 2 programs a month, and then my other colleagues and I then would kind of swap off weeks and take turns. And that actually proved to be a big success. And the first one I did, the first program, I thought I'll do the actual presentation, the history presentation. We had no idea what kind of response we get. And I thought I'll do it myself rather than having a guest presenter. That way, if it's a complete disaster, at least I've only embarrassed myself. I haven't embarrassed a guest. And we didn't really have any technical glitches. And I think we had 160 people sign up for it. So, and I think it really was, people were ready to get out and do something. And being able to do a virtual program, especially over the lunch hour, it was from noon to 1, really just, it was a perfect fit. So that was.
I have one logistic question for you. I was thinking about this the other day. So the museum was closed, of course, during COVID, but as probably some people are aware, there are certain artifacts that require certain climate control settings so was somebody literally keeping the museum, running even though it wasn't closed because of, the contents of the building?
Yes, yeah, there were always a few people there, and we had all kinds of measures in place where, and literally we'd kind of sign in. So if I was going in on a Tuesday, I knew I'm in on Tuesday, and I'm going to be up on the 5th floor, and someone else will be in, but they're going to stay on the 2nd floor. So we're just going to kind of make sure we know where each other is at, and we're keeping our distance, so we can kind of do some of that basic housekeeping stuff, but still maintain social distancing.
Well, let's talk a little bit about your current job. You are now, and correct me if I'm wrong, you are now the archivist at the Berks History Center. All right, so here's my first question for you. For anybody that doesn't know, this vocabulary, what is the difference between a curator and an archivist?
That is a great question. I'll give this short answer, and then I'll tell you a little bit more, explain a little bit more about my story getting to this position, just to clarify people that might be confused. Because if people have sort of half followed my career, they might be a little mixed up, and I want to set them straight. But a general guideline is the curator takes care of 3-dimensional objects: clothing, Pennsylvania long rifles, pottery, silverware, stuff like that. An archivist takes care of old documents, maps, photographs, blueprints, things like that. A lot of the same concepts are involved, but sort of different facets of museum work. What I was going to say is, so I had worked with the State Museum for about 6 years, and I actually got involved a little bit doing some contract work, sort of consulting work with the Berks History Center, which for many years was known as the Historical Society of Berks County. That causes some confusion for some folks. They're one and the same. And next thing you know, I was offered the position of curator at the Berks History Center. And I thought, well, I really enjoy my work at the State Museum, and it's a good place to work, but Berks History Center, that's my family heritage. And with my dad's family, my dad passed away in 2012. He really loved family history. He loved Reading. He loved Reading beer. He loved the pagoda. And in a way, this may sound weird, but I kind of accepted the job thinking in my mind that Dad would be so tickled to know that I'm going to the Berks History Center, our family's home county historical society. And and so I was curator here 3 years, 3.5 years. But then the State Museum lured me back, and they were saying, "Oh, you should come back. You should come back." And I felt like I was being a little wishy-washy, but I said, "Okay, I'll come back." And I'll be frank. There's sort of this sort of balancing act between, I really love this place, but this job has better pay and benefits. And so there's a lot to balance out in a situation like that. And so then I went back to the State Museum in late 2019, right in time for COVID to hit. And it was a good experience. I really enjoyed it the second time around. And being able to kind of come up with those programs in the midst of COVID, it was a great team victory. We had so much fun doing that, and really enjoyed the chance to connect with my colleagues in new ways as we were doing that. But 2 weeks into it, I missed Berks County. State Museum, I can only say positive things, but Berks County is home. And I missed it. So when the position of archivist came up, and I thought, now I'm going to be wishy-washy yet again, but I went for it because I missed it, and I love it, and really, really enjoy working at the State Museum. But working here in Berks County is absolutely my passion.
So just to kind of also maybe answer questions people might have about, the role of an archivist, or at least your job there at the History Center. So yes, you are of course maintaining the archives of the Berks History Center, and but then you also are, as new pieces come in, that's part of your responsibility as well, I'm
Correct.
sure.
Yes. Yeah.
And if somebody comes in off the street and says, "Hey, I want to know something about X. Help me." That's also your job too, right?
Correct. Yes. Now we have another archivist. Her name is Lisa Adams, and she's really our reference expert. She's fantastic about that, and I'd be in big trouble without her, because she knows the answers to 88% of those questions that we get in. And we, just as you described, that literally happens every day. Someone will come in, and sometimes it's something we know exactly where to help them. "Hey, I'm interested in the Union Canal. Can you help me out?" And Lisa will say, "Oh, yes, right over here is our canal collection." And sometimes they'll come in with a crazy question like, "My grandfather fought in the Civil War. Can you tell me all about it?" And well, okay, we have to dig a little bit first. So it's just every day it's something new, and it's actually really, I really love it. And Lisa probably does about 3/4 to maybe 4/5 of the reference work, and I help out here and there with it. But I'll tell you a story about an experience I had recently, which to me really, I think, sums up why I love being here so much. There was a man who reached out to me, and he said his great grandfather had tuberculosis, and they sent him to the tuberculosis sanitarium, which was in Hamburg on Old Route 22, just east of town. And he said that nobody really knows what happened to his great grandfather. He knew he died, and there was a cemetery there on the property where these tuberculosis patients were buried. But back then, before we had protection against tuberculosis, that was like, it was, people didn't want to go there. So a lot of times when your loved one got tuberculosis, you sent them to the sanitarium. It was goodbye. It was goodbye. And very sad stories. surround really everyone that went there. It's basically a place where you went to die and not see your family again. So this man had no idea where was his great grandfather buried there on the grounds. What happened to him? He had no idea. So I thought, well, I can help with this. I know where to look for records for this, and I was able to find his great grandfather's death certificate, and it indicated that he did die at the sanitarium of tuberculosis. This is about 1916. But it turns out that rather than bury him in on the grounds of the sanitarium, he had, it seems like his wife and kids sort of had written him off, but he had a sister who still kept close with him apparently, and the sister claimed his body and brought it back to her house, or her home I should say, in western Pennsylvania, and had him buried out there, out near Pittsburgh. And nobody else in the family knew about this, and I only found out because it indicated it on the death certificate. So then I pulled up findagrave.com, a fun site for history buffs, and in 5 minutes I found his tombstone right there. So then I sent the man the death certificate, I sent him the tombstone, I said, I found your great grandpa. And the man wrote back and he said, Brad, I'm sitting here in tears because for decades I had no idea where my great grandpa was, and now I know. And nothing is more satisfying than an encounter like that. And we do that. That's a little bit of an extra special, but we have encounters like that every week. And oh my goodness, it's wonderful to just be able to connect with people that are in our community here or our extended community because their ancestors lived here. And oh, it's just wonderful to dig into these stories with people and help them out.
All right, here's the $1 million question for you. Given your background and your history, what do you say to somebody that says or asks you, why should I study history? Why should I learn about the past? What do you say to that person?
Oh boy, that's a loaded question,
It
Ben.
is. Oh, it absolutely is.
But a very valid question. And so I'm also, I don't know if I mentioned this, I also am a adjunct college professor at Alvernia University here in Reading. So I teach a lot of students who kind of ask me the same question. I'm a nursing major, I'm a criminal justice major, I'm an engineering major. Why do I have to know this? And my belief is that humans are very predictable. They follow the same patterns over and over and over and over again. So technology changes, systems of government come and go, but humans, we're very consistent in our absurd ways. History helps us to understand that. And I really feel like any situation you can look at, like, okay, what's going on with Russia and Ukraine? It's distressing and there are a lot of question marks. But if we take a step back and look at history, history provides us with precedents in the form of previous situations, and we can see how those play out. And it gives us insight into how to best respond to this current situation. It gives us understanding. It gives us wisdom that we wouldn't have otherwise.
That's a great answer to that $1 million question. I can't second enough. I mean, I teach one history class a year, and I get disinterested high school students that are like the same thing. Like, oh, why do I have to know this? And I would say, and I have said, a very similar response to what you just gave. And I think you're dead on. Plus I always say, plus it's so darn cool.
Yeah.
They might not always think that, but I do at least.
Yeah. Well, and I was going to say, and again, so speaking with candor, sometimes I get a little bit too into the esoteric and I can tell I'm losing people. but I always know when I am, and I try and keep it relevant to the lay person. That's always my goal. But I know some people that just so into the minutia. And when I say people, I mean other museum professionals, other historians, other professors. And I see them just go a little bit too deep into the minutia and lose an audience. And for me, it's really keeping it relevant is a challenge, but it's a fun challenge. I enjoy keeping it relevant.
Yeah, I think
But
well, I think that's also that fine line that a museum has to walk. That we need to tell this whatever that museum's story is that they're trying to tell. You have to tell it so that anybody off the street with someone that has background knowledge, but also someone that's coming in with zero background knowledge, can walk away with something, from. And I think that's a tough job. It really
yeah,
is.
but I really think, kind of getting back to what I said about humans are follow the same patterns. I think there are ways to tell a story that make it more interesting when you add human emotion to the story. It can really make it a lot more compelling for people. And so that's something I always try and do. So make it relatable. Sometimes I miss the mark, I'm sure, but that's always my goal.
It's a good goal to have. It's a good goal to have for sure. Well, Brad, I close every interview the same way, and I know that you've listened to previous episodes, so you might know the questions that are coming, but I'm going to ask them anyway. Are you ready for your 10 quick questions?
Sure.
All right, here we go. Number one, what is your morning drink of choice?
Diet soda, though I keep saying I gotta stop that.
So you're not a traditional like coffee or tea drinker. Have
No.
have you always been a soda for breakfast kind of guy?
Well, no, I wouldn't say always, but I know so many people drink coffee, and I'm not a fan of coffee, but I do feel like the caffeine wakes me up. So I've lately have been I'll drink a Coke Zero or something like that. But I keep saying I think these chemicals are probably bad for me. Next week I'm going to start drinking water.
Yeah.
I've been saying that for 3 years now.
One of these years, Brad. One of these years.
Yeah.
All right, number two. Who is a go-to musical artist or group for you?
Hmm. Um. I'm going to say the Beatles, and I feel like that's sort of a generic answer. And if given more time, I'd think of six other choices for you. But
There's nothing wrong with the Beatles. Absolutely not. No, that's a good one. All right, this I'm curious about. Given your background, what movie can you watch over and over again and it never gets old? Now, here's my thought. It's gonna be. Is it a history movie? Is it some like adaptation of an event from history, or is it Blazing Saddles?
I'm going to say The Great Escape.
Oh yeah, that is a great film. That is a great
And
film.
probably about the same time I was watching Barry Bostwick beat George Washington, I was watching The Great Escape. And again, I was out there on my bicycle pretending I was Steve McQueen, trying to motorcycle away from the Nazis.
Yeah, I hear you.
And they're 10 years old pedaling away. My friends thought I was nuts.
I'm gonna put you on the spot. What is a history based movie that you think really does a good job at being accurate?
Oh, that's a great question. Well, I thought you were going to say inaccurate, and I was going to give
Well,
you a
I'll
good.
ask you. I'll ask you. Let's do the accurate one, and then I'll give you a shot for one really inaccurate film.
Okay, good. Um, oh boy. Well, I think The Great Escape, they changed some of the personalities, but the basic facts of the movie are pretty accurate. Um, the Lincoln movie that came out a few years ago with Daniel Day-Lewis, I really liked that. I thought that was really pretty spot on.
All right, give me
Uh,
one that is really, really wrong or inaccurate.
probably number one on my most hated list is The Patriot.
Ooh, and so many people love that movie.
I know. Even some of my coworkers really love it. But I'll tell you why. Um, there's a scene in that movie where they walk up to Mel Gibson's property, and there are African Americans working there, and I forget. It's been years since I've seen the movie, but someone says something like, "Oh, is your master here?" And the response is, "Oh, we're not slaves, we're employees, all of us are." And that really rubbed me the wrong way. And I'll tell you why. People, and I know this is in our current political climate, I don't want to offend anybody. There's a lot of different views on how bad was it, how much should we talk about it, etc. But the reality is, whatever side of that argument you're on, it existed, it was bad. And to create a movie in the deep South, or that might have been South Carolina, not
Yeah,
exactly
South
deep
Carolina.
South.
Yep.
I guess that's the deep South. To sort of skirt around that and kind of create the scenario of, oh, well, some African Americans were treated quite well during the antebellum or Revolutionary War period, I feel like really glosses over a hard reality that we can't gloss over.
Well, we might have to have you on just to have another conversation about that whole topic sometime. It's
I'd
something
enjoy
that,
that.
yeah, we'll save that. But no, there are other tons of. I've read tons of articles on the historical inaccuracies of that movie, and I mean, yeah, storytelling and entertaining. Yeah, I think it hits all those things. But from a truth standpoint, oof, that movie's, yeah, that's a little rough.
And another one that's very similar to that is Gods and Generals, the Civil War movie. I really like the Gettysburg movie.
Mm-hmm.
Gods and Generals I didn't like because of the same problems that I had with it. Um, there's one scene where the white slave owners are literally hugging their slave in the midst of the Battle of Fredericksburg. And while that might have been a reality some of the time, I think that was not
The norm.
common, not the norm.
Yeah.
And to not show a broader representation that was more normal,
Yeah.
I think does a disservice to
Yeah.
people.
Yeah. I hear you. I hear you. All right. Next one. What is the last thing that you read?
Good question.
Tell me it was like some land deed from 1742 or something like that.
Well, yeah, probably the last thing I was reading in depth was the historical and biographical annals of Berks County by Morton Montgomery. That came out about the turn of the century, 1900-ish, but I love it. And it's my go-to. Now, sometimes he embellishes a little bit. He's kind of that Victorian era historian, but it's kind of my go-to for at least starting to understand an aspect of one story or another. And I actually feel like he was pretty good compared to some of that era. Plus, he was a trustee of the historical
History Center.
society of
Oh, well,
Berks
there you go.
County.
There you go. Next question, number 5. What's your favorite pizza topping?
I typically will get a plain pizza, and if I do get toppings, it's usually something like ham.
Okay. All
All
right.
hams.
Okay. Laying on the beach or going for a hike?
Hike.
Okay. All right,
No
here we go.
question.
You've invited me over for dinner. What are you making?
Oh boy. Um, well, if it's you coming,
Yeah.
I'd do something Dutch, like
Okay.
Schnitzenepp or something.
I'll come over for
I'm,
Schnitzenknepp. Absolutely.
ich bin schlimm für Schnitzenepp.
Yeah. Ja. All right. A dream vacation destination for you.
Germany,
Okay.
Esmoderland.
Have you been yet?
No.
Oh
And
my
you know what?
goodness.
I literally have wanted to go since I was in my early teens. And and it just never has worked
Yeah.
out. And hopefully it will one day. But oh man, I'd really like to get there.
Yeah, you'd be a kid in a candy store over there with all the, I mean, great museums and historical sites, and then, with your background in culture and language as well.
Oh
Oh, you'd
yeah,
love it. You'd absolutely love it. You'll make it. You'll make it there. I know you will. You'll enjoy it
one
too.
day.
All right. What is something you're afraid of?
Hmm. I I would say that I am a pretty gentle soul. I think I really got mad last in about 1997. I may be exaggerating a little bit. It might have been 2002. So when there are other people around who are really getting angry and almost aggressively so, that's very uncomfortable to me. So I'm afraid of, I don't want to say I'm fearful on a daily basis of this, but if I see a tense situation brewing, I get a little afraid of that just because I don't like that. I like calm situations and calm people. And when I see building tension, I get a little afraid of how much is this tension going to
No,
build?
I hear you. I hear you. It's a good answer. It's a good answer. All right, last question. What you've had some awesome jobs, but what is one job other than one that you've had that you would love to have?
Well, I have thought it would be fun to be a physics teacher.
Okay.
And that's probably a curveball for you,
Yeah, totally.
but my my dad was a mechanical engineer and actually double major, mechanical and chemical. So he was very, very math brained. My mom's degree was in history, but actually before she was a history major, she was a biology major at Penn State. So I'm sort of this anomaly in that most of the people I work with, very gifted people, very smart people, but they all say, "Oh, I'm not a math person. That's why I went to history." But I'm the opposite. I'm very mathy in the way my brain works. And I look at everything almost like an equation, and I'm always trying to balance the equation. And so I've always loved kind of as a side hobby science and physics, and I'm always reading about like, well, how far would it be to get to Proxima Centauri b, which is the nearest possibly habitable planet. And so I think about that stuff all the time. And I'm in a good environment for finding people to talk about George Washington and Barry Bostwick. I have a lot harder time finding people to talk about Proxima Centauri b. But I've often thought, boy, wouldn't it be fun to be able to do that as a job too? And and if you're, I feel like to be a typical high school teacher like you are, I might lose patience with some of the student shenanigans. But I've thought by the time you get to physics, you kind of have to be a committed enough student that you're taking your studies seriously. So I felt if I taught physics in high school, I'd avoid some of the shenanigans of the less dedicated students and be able to talk about this little side thing that I think is really fascinating.
I love your description of less dedicated. That's good. I'm gonna start using that instead of what I usually call some of those kids. Brad, it has been an absolute joy to have this conversation with you and get to know you a little bit better. I mean, I felt that I knew you. We've had a lot of interactions over the years, but I got to ask you some questions that I've often wanted to ask you. So I'm just glad that you came up on the show. Like I said, I'll post a link to the State Museum. I'll also post a link to the Berks History Center, another awesome awesome museum to check out with a great archive. So if you're in that greater Berks County area, it is a gem that I think a lot of people don't realize how cool of a place it is. So thanks again, Brad, for coming up here on the front porch, and it was a pleasure talking to you again.
You're welcome. Hey, before you go, could I ask you a question?
Sure, sure.
And I was going to ask, do you remember where you and I first met? It was a long time ago, and I remember the answer, but it's a good story.
I think my knee-jerk reaction would be at Kutztown University for something Pennsylvania Dutch related, but that is going back quite a number of years.
So you were absolutely right. And what it was many years ago when Dr. Voluska was the head of the Pennsylvania German Studies program. And him and William Donner had this idea of bringing together all these people in the Pennsylvania Dutch community who were writing or doing things, and bringing them together to have a discussion about the idea of creating a Pennsylvania German Studies minor. And I remember you distinctly because I think it was you and I and Robert Lush. I'm not sure if I'm saying his last name right.
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
Because he had deutscherei.org, very early Dutch website. You were already doing that. That might even be pre-internet, but you were still you were young. You were probably I was young. I was probably mid-20s. I don't even know if you were.
I would have. Yeah, I might have been like a senior in college or right out of college, something like that. Yeah.
And but then here we were with, there's Richard Druckenbrot. I'm probably not saying his name right.
Yeah.
Lee Tiervector.
Yeah.
Eugene Stein. All these people like whose books I've had and read, and now I'm in the same room with them, and I'm being asked for my opinion. I thought,
yeah,
let the masters speak. I'm just here to soak this in.
That's what I remember about that day too. There's times in your life, and some people never get to experience, of meeting somebody that you really admire or look up to, and the people that have had that opportunity, that a lot of times turn out to be great. And like I was in your situation, where I was meeting some of these people that I only knew their name and the stuff that they've written, and these things, these were the experts. I mean, these are the sages in the robes that are walking the halls. And like you said, here they are coming up and talking to us young whippersnappers, and not only just saying, well, it's nice to meet you, but also, well, what do you think? It was a humbling experience.
Absolutely.
Because, they wouldn't have had to have done that. And that's a great, you brought up a very great memory. Thanks, Brad.
Sure. Dick Beam was there.
Yep.
Dr. Klein.
Yeah, jeez. Yeah, the problem is that most of the names we listed have now passed on. So I guess we're starting to we're getting grayer, and that means that we have to start turning to the younger people in that community as well. So I look forward to that challenge. So
yeah. That's another podcast though.
Yeah, I think it is. All right, Brad, thanks so much. We'll be in touch, and I can't wait to talk to you again.
All right, sounds good, my friend. Take care.
Yeah, mach's gut.
Du-ah.
Thank you for listening to Doug's Front Porch, a conversational podcast with your host, Doug Maidenford. If you enjoyed this episode, I'd love for you to subscribe, rate, and give a review on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts from. 5 stars only, please. Follow along on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Just look for Doug's Front Porch. Also, please feel free to tell all of your friends about the show, and I'll see you all next time on my front porch.